Okay, we should be live now. Let me see if my music will work. Check 1, 2. Let me see. Okay. 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 This is not working. This is not working. This is not working. This is not working. This is not I don't know how to make it stop. All right. I have tried. I've tried. Maybe there's something going on with that. 10 and 2 o'clock, sit still, chill, and wait for further instructions. It's easy to remember. 10 and 2 o'clock has to do with your hand placement on the steering wheel. So a lot of people, when they're stopped, they'll start going through their glove compartment, looking for their license and their registration. And the truth of the matter is, law enforcement doesn't want us to be doing any type of movements in our cars before they get up to our window. They don't know what you're looking for. You could be looking to find a weapon of some sort. So the less movement in your car, the better. The more movement puts them on edge, puts them on alert, because they don't know what you're doing. And when they're getting out of their squad car, they're trained to look through your back window into the car to see who's in the car, how many people's in the car, and what you're doing in the car. So if you're aware of this, just know when you get pulled over and your hands are like this and you're not moving at all, that's a good sign for law enforcement. That's a good start to their interaction with us. Whether you agree with it or not, I'm just giving you feedback from members of law enforcement. Okay? When you're stopped, 10 and 2 o'clock, sit still, chill, and wait for further instructions. The reason why you should not, well, why we should not be looking for our driver's license, proof of insurance, and registration is because we don't know if the officers that have pulled us over want us to do any of that. They might be pulling us over to give us a warning, like you have ball tires, you have a tail light that's out. It could be anything. They may not want your driver's license, proof of insurance, or proof of registration. So rather than try and read the officer's mind, just wait for them to give you instructions. Okay? So I want to read some of the notes that we took as it relates to this. So all motorists should know to keep their hands at 10 and 2 o'clock when pulled over and wait for further instructions from law enforcement once they arrive at the driver's side window. Any movement inside the car puts law enforcement on a heightened sense of alert. Public safety standard behavior better ensures the safety of the motorist and the officer. This is a must. Members of law enforcement and members of the community suggest that this be a standard question on the California driver's test and in the driver's test guide. This 10 and 2 o'clock behavior when pulled over is a common sense public safety practice that increases effective communication between the community and law enforcement. Okay, so not only does that jingle allow you to most easily remember what to do, both members of law enforcement and the general public think that on the driver's test and in the driver's test study guide, that this question should be posed so that people know what to do when they're pulled over. You can't get your license, you can't get your driver's license without having standardized traffic stop behavior in the study guide and then questions on standard traffic stop behavior. So just to recap, members of law enforcement and members of the general public agree that standardized traffic stop behavior should be on the California driver's test and in the study driver's test manual or guide, whatever it is. And so the question should be, what should you do when you get pulled over on the street? And the correct answer should be, when you're stopped, hands at 10 and 2 o'clock, sit still, chill, and wait for further instructions. It makes it easy. If we all know what to do when we get pulled over on the street, and the cops know that we know, it eliminates a lot of misunderstandings before the interaction between us and law enforcement takes place. So that's for street. What happens if you're on the freeway and you see in your rearview mirror that a member of law enforcement has their lights on and they want you to pull over? So they came up with this solution. And the solution for the highway is far right hazard lights. So let me go over the notes. When motorists are on a freeway and have been given audio visual instructions, lights and sirens, to pull over by law enforcement, yet don't feel comfortable pulling over due to darkness or safety concerns, the motorist should turn on their hazard lights. And that's to let the officer know that you're acknowledging the fact that they want you to pull over. And then proceed to get in the far right-hand lane, not in the shoulder, the far right-hand lane. Drive at a slower speed and proceed to the nearest off-ramp and pull off and pull over at the first well-lit area, such as a gas station. Once the motorist brings their car to a stop and puts it in park, then we go right back to when you're stopped, hands at 10 and 2 o'clock, sit still, chill, and wait for further instructions. So I'm going to say that again. When you're on the freeway and a cop wants to pull you over, far right hazard lights. What's that mean? Put on your hazard lights and they get in the far right-hand lane, proceed to the nearest off-ramp, and then pull into the first well-lit area so that that member of law enforcement can make their contact with you for whatever reason they wanted you to pull over in the first place. Okay? This came up as a topic, as a problem to address, because California Highway Patrol has told us that their job is dangerous. They're pulling over people on a high-speed freeway. There are hazards to that. I mean, we've seen videos of a traffic stop taking place on the side of a road and a car plowing into both the cop car and the car that they stopped. And California Highway Patrol refers to that as getting smoked. It sounds funny, but it's not funny. You're on the side of the freeway on the shoulder, and when an oncoming car smashes into them, that's what they refer to it as, is getting smoked. So there's that danger of getting pulled over on the freeway for both the officer and the motorist that has been pulled over. That goes up exponentially at night. There are motorists that don't feel comfortable in the middle of nowhere. Like there's this strip along the 5 freeway here in California by Las Pulgas. That's one of the exits. It is a strip of nothing. It is dark. There are no lights. There's no off-ramp. And getting pulled over there, female motorists have told us that they don't feel comfortable being pulled over at night in that environment with a member of law enforcement. And it stems from years ago in the 90s, there was a police officer that was pulling over female motorists. I believe it was on the 15 freeway in San Diego, making them get off at some remote area, and he was raping them. This was a thing in the 90s. So in order to eliminate that, if we change the laws on how we get pulled over when we're driving on the freeway, it eliminates getting smoked and it eliminates getting pulled over in some area where there's no lights and anything can go down and there's no proof. You scream for help, nobody can hear you. So they just thought it was a common sense practice to put into law that we're no longer doing traffic stops on the freeway. We're going to proceed to the nearest off-ramp. So those are two things. Street stops. When you're stopped, 10 and 2 o'clock, sit still, chill, wait for further instructions. When you're on the freeway, hazard lights, far right. Then when you get off at that off ramp and you pull into a well lit area, you go right back to when you're stopped, 10 and 2 o'clock, sit still, chill, and wait for further instructions. So they also feel that this highway traffic stop protocol should also be on the driver's test, the written test here in California, and the driver's manual study guide. So those are two solutions that are game changer participants of both law enforcement and community residents devised together. I want to make that clear. This is not law enforcement telling us what to do. These are two solutions that people like you and I and members of law enforcement came up with together during game changer trainings. Okay. Third action item. The elimination of bias calls. You might be wondering what's a bias call. Well, this term bias call was introduced to us by the former chief of Coronado. And this term bias call is basically a Karen call. It has morphed into mainstream as a Karen call. And I want to read my notes to you verbatim. Multiple members of law enforcement representing various law enforcement agencies discussed what to all civilians was a new term. Not all of law enforcement uses it, but all know exactly what the term means. The term is called bias calls. Below is the most frequent type of bias call described by the chief of police in Coronado. This was back in, I want to say, 2017. So here's a typical bias call. Caller to 911. Yes, I need an officer here right now. There's a black guy on my street. Dispatcher. Okay, what is he doing? Caller. Nothing. He's just on my street. Dispatcher. There's a black man on your street and he's not doing anything wrong or suspicious. Caller. No, he's not doing anything, but he's on my street and I don't feel safe. Send an officer here right away. The dispatcher relays the call specifics to an officer who typically knows it's a BS call as described by the police chief. Yet the officer still winds up interacting with a man who's committed no crime nor exhibited any suspicious behavior. When questioned why law enforcement would continue to appease the type of people who make these types of calls while violating the civil rights of an innocent civilian, the chief stated that they are under tremendous political pressure that could affect their employment to respond to these calls. The chief went on to say that 99.9% of these calls are made by white residents. White people are the people making bias calls, Karen calls. When asked if they ever received any bias call from a Latino or a black person saying there's a white person on my street, it was comical. It was a comical question. They don't get those calls. They only get calls from white residents saying there's a Latino on my street. There's a Mexican on my street. There's a black guy on my street. So law enforcement is telling us these things happen. And so we're like, as community residents, well, how do we solve this problem? How do we solve this problem? Full disclosure, I don't know if the sheriff is still in this particular county in Ohio. I don't remember the county. But I was surfing the web and I saw that this sheriff decided to take matters into his own hands because he had to deal with an abundance of bias Karen calls in his county. So he sent an email out to all his constituents. I say constituents, remember the sheriff is elected. And in that email, he said, listen, we welcome your calls for legitimate issues, legitimate safety issues. But calling 911 simply because there's a person on your street that isn't the same demographic as you, doesn't have the same skin color as you, that's not a good use of our resources. Now, on the rare occasion a dispatcher dismisses these types of calls and terminates the conversation, sometimes callers will immediately call back and say, for example, I just called you and now this person is looking into cars. Both the dispatcher and officer on call know that the second call was most likely a lie, but they must respond because the caller is on record stating that they are witnessing suspicious behavior. To add insult to injury, and what I'm about to say, this is coming from law enforcement. Officers have reported that if an officer of color responds to a bias call, the caller will once again call 911 and tell the dispatcher, send over a white cop. I don't want a black cop. I don't want a Mexican cop. Dispatchers have confirmed these calls as well. So, my biggest issue with bias calls and how members of law enforcement are responding to them is that these calls and the policies and procedures of a particular law enforcement agency is causing drama and ill will that is totally avoidable between law enforcement and some innocent person walking in the street. The person that has the true problem, the internal problem, is the caller. If you got a problem with people of color being on your street, that's a personal problem, and you need counseling for that. Law enforcement should not get involved in your own personal issues. And yet, as I shared with you, you have chiefs saying that I have to respond to these calls. I'm beholden to these people. The mayor expects me to send my officers out to these calls. And let's keep it real. The higher income residents in that neighborhood that contribute to the police officers fund, that may donate to a campaign, they expect that type of response from law enforcement. And it's just wrong. I'll go back to what I said before. When law enforcement responds to calls like that, they are appeasing someone who has their own racial fears, might just flat out be a bigot, or they might just flat out be racist. You're appeasing that person and at the same time violating someone's civil rights. They're not doing anything. So, how do you address that problem? Well, the best solution that was devised by law enforcement and community residents to address this particular problem was find the person. This person that called in and said, there's a Mexican guy on my street, and that's it. Find him $200 for that. It doesn't sound like it's ever going to happen, but the place you could hurt people the most is in their wallet. And if you're making some ridiculous call because of your own personal issues or racial fears and you're bringing law enforcement into it, and law enforcement wants that to stop, how else are you going to stop it? So that was the solution that they came up with to address that particular issue. Fourth action item, public disclosure of information. So let me read this. Local law enforcement agencies and district attorneys should work together to disclose firings on a quarterly basis. Identities of officers are not revealed unless a crime has been committed. The transparency fosters more trust between law enforcement and community residents. The transparency shows that there is accountability and that the blue wall of silence is crumbling. So, during a game changer training event in San Diego, I want to say the year was either 2017 or 2018. We had the district attorney participate. She's the current district attorney in San Diego. Her name is Summer Stephan. And she's the one who came up with the idea that on a quarterly basis, that the DA's office should publicly state, whether it's on a website, maybe the state of the county address every quarter, something like that, and reveal to the general public how many officers have been fired, what they were fired for, how many officers have been reprimanded or suspended for their behavior, and that they should do this on a quarterly basis. Now, I don't know if you all know this, but there's a Bill of Rights here in California for law enforcement. And that Bill of Rights protects law enforcement and has some pretty strict guidelines as it relates to protecting officers' identities. That's why in that solution, unless an officer has committed a crime, they don't want to reveal which officer, by name, did so and so that was an egregious act that's not a fireable offense, but it's an offense that they needed to get suspended for. Now, I know that some of you that are watching this may say, well, how are we to believe that? They could just be making these numbers up. And you know what? You're right. I agree with you. I agree with you. Unless the DA's office can come up with an ironclad plan to be able to demonstrate that this information that they're sharing us is true, that these officers were indeed suspended, these officers were indeed relieved of their duties, and if you're getting fired for breaking the law, that's a whole different category. That's criminal. Your name and your face are going to be plastered all over the internet and television if you've committed a crime. But if you've broken policy and procedure, the general public wants to know that if you're going to come at us and say, we'll police ourselves, you need to trust us, because that's what law enforcement is. Whenever there's a crime, whenever there's an incident, we all know that law enforcement will do their own internal investigation. And more often than not, that internal investigation comes back to the general public as we did this investigation and there was no wrongdoing by the officer. And people are just tired of that, tired of hearing that. And so the DA in San Diego said, I hear you. We need to be more transparent. And this is one of the ways that we should be more transparent. Now, if you know her, and Summer, if you're watching this, I want to remind you that you didn't do that. You had this great idea, and yet it wasn't implemented. So if you're watching this, I'd love to discuss how we can take what was your idea and put it in place so that it's a reality. All right. Lastly, last action item, last solution, rights and responsibility cards. Back in the day, San Diego had hard copy rights and responsibility cards. So what were on those cards? What was on those cards? On the cards was the rights and responsibilities of the motorist, meaning These are your rights, but these are also your responsibilities when you interact with law enforcement. And I believe on the other side of the card was the rights and responsibilities of the officer that has pulled you over. So think about it. I get pulled over. I know what my rights and responsibilities are when I get pulled over, and so does the member of law enforcement pulling me over. Also, I know the rights and responsibilities of the officer, and the officer knows that I know. So we've got all of this pre-planned knowledge and behavior of what's expected, what my rights are, what their rights are, and we know what each other's rights are. That can eliminate a lot of future drama. How many of us have seen videos of somebody getting pulled over, asserting their rights, and the officer not agreeing? I know my rights. No, you don't. That's not right. Arguing turns left, and before you know it, some tragedy has happened. So having rights and responsibility cards that is public knowledge. Everyone knows what their own rights and responsibilities are, and they also know the rights and responsibilities of the other party before the traffic stop takes place. That's called being proactive, addressing an issue before an issue even arises. So let me read to you. All citizens and officers should keep rights and responsibility cards in their vehicles at all times or on their cell phones. That's what we can have it in 2024. Citizens should know their rights and the rights of law enforcement during a traffic stop or pedestrian stop. Law enforcement should know their rights and the rights of citizens during a traffic stop or pedestrian stop. Citizens should know their responsibilities and the responsibilities of law enforcement during a traffic stop or pedestrian stop, and vice versa. This sets behavior expectations and standards before the interaction begins and can go a long way to prevent escalation and prevent needless, tragic circumstances. It sounds easy, doesn't it? And yet they don't exist. A couple of officers said, well, in order to get this done, you're probably going to have to include the ACLU so that they can bring the citizen perspective to what the rights and responsibilities are going to be. And my response to that was, I don't care. I don't care who you have to get into a room, but we need to collectively, as a society, bring government, meaning law enforcement, to the table and community residents so we can agree upon what each other's rights and responsibilities are so that before that traffic stop interaction occurs, I have a clear understanding of what's expected of me. And the officer has a clear understanding of what's expected of them. And we both know it. That should, in theory, eliminate at least the back and forth between I know my rights. So, for example, you have a right to record your own traffic stop with your cell phone. But there's a caveat to that. As long as you're not interfering with an officer conducting their investigation, you can film your traffic stop. If an officer tells you that you can't, they're violating your rights. And if we have that rights and responsibility card on our person and the officers are trained and also have on their phone what our rights and responsibilities are and what their rights and responsibilities are, we should never have another conversation about put your phone down or turn your phone off. I don't have to turn my phone off. If I have my phone on my dashboard or I have a dash cam inside my car, whatever, officer should never be telling me to turn it off, especially if my hands are at 10 and 2 o'clock. You're being filmed. You're using your body worn camera to film this interaction. I'm using my dash cam to film it. Don't tell me to turn it off. I'm well within my rights. And that's what I'm saying. If we have rights and responsibility cards that are public information, where we get to a point where everyone in society knows what their rights and responsibilities are when they get pulled over by law enforcement and vice versa, it would go a long way to mitigating any future misunderstandings that lead to, all right, I'm yanking you out the car now. We don't even want to get to that point. So I feel like since de-escalation is such a major point of emphasis in training in California, having rights and responsibility cards, electronic cards, available for everyone to have is part of de-escalation training. It's simple. It's a simple thing to do. And I believe it would be extremely inexpensive. One last thing. I want to go all the way back to what we were talking about as it relates to traffic stops. Whether you're being stopped on the street or on the freeway. I forgot to mention this. I told you that they recommended that the DMV take the initiative and put those questions of what do you do when you're stopped in the street by law enforcement, and what do you do when you're stopped on the freeway by law enforcement? The last part to the solution to those issues as it relates to standardizing traffic stop behavior is to create a public service video that plays on loop while you're in the DMV waiting, showing what to do when you're stopped. We've all been in that waiting room. Sometimes you're waiting in that room for a long time. I know we have our phones to keep us occupied, but having that video being played on those monitors as to what to do when you're stopped in the street and what to do when you are stopped on the freeway also goes a long way, in my opinion, as being part of de-escalation training. So that's our midday check-in. I wanted to go through those various things that we came up with as a collective of solutions to problems that should be implemented on the state level, on the local level, and they're not. So let me know how you feel about what you heard today, some of these solutions. Let me check the chat. I don't know if anybody tapped in while we were. Nobody chatted, but if you're checking out this video on our Cops and Convicts YouTube channel, let us know what you think about these solutions that citizens and cops came up with together. And I'll get back with you next time. Have a great Friday. I don't know if you're watching the Tyson Paul fight. I love Mike. I think Mike's going to lose tonight. And the reason why I think Mike Tyson's going to lose tonight is because he's 50 some odd years old, and I don't know how he's going to respond to being hit. You know, Jake Paul is what he is, but he has demonstrated that he has some boxing skill and he has some power. And, you know, under normal circumstances, he wouldn't have a snowball's chance in hell against Mike Tyson. But when's the last time that Mike has been hit? And that's my only concern. If he could take Jake Paul's best shot at his age, I think he's going to wind up destroying Jake Paul. Either way, I'll be watching. For those of you that know me, I'm a Knicks fan, and they're trying to get their act together. So wish me luck. Wish your boy luck. Until next time, be good. Be safe. God bless.